This is your Day X World War III update. The Russians are getting ready to revise their nuclear doctrine. This tells you that we are indeed on the razor's edge of radioactivity. Here is what's going down. So 2 months ago, recall, I believe it was Vladimir Putin or some other high-ranking official inside Russia indicated that, we're thinking about revising our nuclear doctrine. Now, at the time, people were saying, that's just the usual nuclear bluster in order to try to discourage Western support for Ukraine. I, of course, at the time indicated that that means that usually when they're saying something like that, when they're telegraphing it for the first time, it means that it's already underway, if not completed, and that indeed they already were working on revising their nuclear doctrine. And I explicitly stated it was for the purpose of lowering the nuclear threshold, because as it currently stands, as the Russians are still trying to maintain their diplomatic persona and not become an international pariah in a legal sense, they still want to be in line with their own doctrines. Even though nuclear doctrines, as I've stated before, they're usually just for public consumption. When push comes to shove, they're going to do whatever for the sake of their own international security, whether it's in a nuclear doctrine or not. But what they're going to do now, because they know that this is a less than strategic, less than mutually assured destruction scenario on the horizon, where they're going to probably have to use nuclear weapons, low-yield nukes, battlefield theater nukes. Now, what this means is that they're going to have to alter the nuclear doctrine so that it doesn't necessitate an existential threat to Russia, an imminent existential threat to Russia, as that's how the current nuclear doctrine is written, that the Russians will only use nuclear weapons if it means Russia's strategic defeat. Now, that's very ambiguous terminology. They can arbitrarily draw the line wherever they want. And of course, you might be thinking to yourself, well, hasn't the West been talking about Russia's strategic defeat for a long time? Yes, indeed, that is true. So this is why it's kind of meaningless. However, in a less than global nuclear annihilation scenario, it is very meaningful for Russia and their allies. What it means is that Russia will be able to clearly establish and adjudicate a red line, which is clear as day for the West to see from a mile away, that indicates that if you overstep a certain boundary, it doesn't need to be our existential risk of losing our society and our civilization as a whole. But if you overstep this boundary, we reserve the right to utilize such and such weapons in such and such a capacity. So they're going to lower the nuclear threshold. Now, why are they bringing this up right now? Obviously, NATO is invading Russia as we speak. Yes, NATO. It's NATO weapons. It's NATO technicians. It's NATO ISR. And there's a lot of NATO mercenaries waving American flags and even American reporters in there, as have come out recently CNN reporters who've already done interviews, but there's masks on their face because they don't want to be identified. So we know this is all real. This is all very much happening. And just so you know, another oil depot is ablaze in Rostov. This one is totally separate from the big one that has been burning for 10 days. I'm telling you guys, this situation is getting out of control. Now, take a look at this. We're going to connect all the dots today. Now, Politico is saying that Ukraine is going to present the Biden administration with targets that it could hit inside Russia if given the chance. I think that this is all a smokescreen, and the Russians certainly know it as well. It is very likely, if the Biden administration is intelligent, and let's not kid ourselves, it's not Joe Biden who is calling any of the shots at this point in time, but let's just pretend it is, that the Biden administration is likely going to reject this appeal by Zelensky to start using Storm Shadow missiles for deep strikes inside Russia, and the long-range ATACMS and the JSAMS missiles that are going to be on the F-16s, that they're going to deny Zelensky's request to do this. That doesn't matter because Zelensky has already stated today, and I talked about this probably over a year and a half ago, that what they're going to do is American technicians, NATO technicians, are going to assist the Ukrainians in creating their own long-range weapon systems, as they already have and have been progressing throughout the course of the war. They've been shooting drones well past St. Petersburg for well over a year now. Okay, it's almost been about a year, and yeah, it's almost been 18 months since the first drones made their way into Moscow, if you remember. Into the Kremlin, in fact, remember that? And so we know that they've been developing these technologies in tandem because, of course, Ukraine is not doing anything independently at this point in time, especially when, Big Daddy Washington is signing the checks. So we know that there's likely American technicians. There's utilizing American intelligence in order to guide these weapon systems, American resources, of course, and in industry and materials in order to create them. And quite possibly the mercenaries on the other end pushing the actual buttons. So we know all this. So what this means is that this is all just a way for the U.S. to claim plausible deniability, and the Russians will have to play along, right? Because the Russians, again, they're very judicious. So they have to uphold this professionalism on the international stage, so not to burn any diplomatic bridges and seem and maintain this aura of reasonability that they've been able to up until this point, at least not necessarily in the West, where we're just a bunch of morons when it comes to this kind of stuff, but in the East, where they see what's going on and they're not blinded by the Western propaganda. They see that, okay, the Russians are at least trying to withhold the use of their most lethal weapons to avoid bringing us to the brink of nuclear destruction. But Ukraine is attempting to circumvent this. I think Ukraine knows that this request to Washington will not be approved, and that they're not going to get the green light to start firing these weapon systems deep behind enemy lines. It doesn't matter because now they have their own ballistic long-range missile systems that Zelensky claims can touch anywhere of significance inside Russia. And these are not the old school mini Cessna-like drones that you can hear from a mile away and you can shoot out of the sky with a shotgun. Obviously, that's exaggerating a little bit, but you get my point. These are far more advanced systems that were built with the help of the United States and NATO. Now, of course, they couldn't come out using these right away. You really have to sell it. Much like the F-16s, you have to sell the idea that it's actually Ukrainian pilots inside those F-16s. So you have to make it out like these guys are going to flight school and that they're the ones actually piloting them. When we know now, and I mean even the statements by the Senator Lindsey Graham, who welcomed, volunteers from the West who've flown F-16s their entire lives to come and volunteer. Things that yours truly has been saying for months. So we know that they do these things on a timeline to make it appear as though Ukraine is doing these things grassroots, that they're creating these technologies by themselves to immunize the United States from criticism that they are the ones providing it so that it doesn't escalate to the nuclear level. But this is not to say that if Russia doesn't change their nuclear threshold to allow for deep strikes that maybe aren't necessarily an existential threat, but are posing significant, strategic risk or pressure, or by a nation, or they might even say something like, they might even designate a certain yield of nuclear weapon, where maybe a yield under 15 kilotons is deemed permissible in certain cases, even though it might not be an existential threat to the country. So I think that's what we're going to see with this nuclear doctrine stuff. This is very, very important. Sergei Lavrov would not. He is not the kind of person to say something like this. Certainly doesn't make any bombastic claims. The farthest thing from incorrigible Dmitry Medvedev. This is a straight shooter, well respected on the international stage. He would only say something like this if there was a lot of fire to that smoke. So this is absolutely something that we need to pay attention to. Zelensky has also stated today that the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine will be permanently suspended after 2024, and there will be no negotiation. So now there is very little economic incentive for Russia with Ukraine, although this might be a part of one of his 4 points of his 4-point victory plan that he is going to be proposing to Joe Biden next month accordingly. Again, it is all just smoke and mirrors to make it appear as though they're not acting in unison when really they are, but it creates the illusion that they're not a proxy for the U.S. War machine, which of course they are. Everybody knows that. Even hardline American patriots know that, and that's the reason why they're resisting the whole thing, because they don't want a nuclear Armageddon situation. It's also been unveiled that Ukraine now has a electronic warfare cloaking system for its F-16s. This has been received from the United States, an exclusive version of an electronic warfare system that turns F-16s into real, invisible planes for Russian radars, according to Defense Express. So this means that if they are able to evade Russian radars, they can target deeper inside Russia, doing more damage. And the question then arises is, what is actually causing these attacks on all of the oil refineries and military bases? And now that they're operating within the Kursk region, where there's currently 30,000 Russian troops present, and 1,200 square kilometers under Ukrainian control. This means that they're potentially leveraging these F-16s in that capacity, either from inside Ukraine or from inside the new territory of Ukraine, which is in the Kursk region. Now, we have some interesting things going on the Belarusian border, where they're moving essentially their entire armed forces into the southern part of their country, the northern part of Ukraine, in and around the region where Chernobyl is. I can't remember the exact name of the oblast. What is the name of the oblast? Again, I don't have the map up today, but that's what's happening. So, and the vehicles are marked B, which perhaps is just a very sophisticated bluff on the part of the Belarusians, because what they're trying to do is fix the Ukrainians to the north and get them to have to commit more of their troops to the north out of fear of a Belarusian incursion from that direction, thus taking troops away from the Kursk initiative. This is just what I'm presuming. I don't have all the details of what's on the ground, but I would presume that what this would force the Ukrainians to do is have to withdraw some of their forces or limit the amount of forces that they've committed to that Kursk initiative, as well as potentially pull more forces away from the Donbass, which is currently not going so well for the Ukrainians. Lukashenko has made all kinds of threats, and recall that he is the one who said that if any line is crossed, that there will be an immediate use of nuclear weapons and no conversations or negotiations about it. Now, of course, he could be a Putin patsy, whereby Vladimir Putin is going to attempt to evade mutually assured destruction by getting a proxy to fire the first nuke. Then what are you going to do? Are you going to, sacrifice Belarus and open up the front so it's a 1,100 kilometer long front line? At this point in time right now, as far as I know, that northern border is heavily mined. It is heavily fortified. So I don't think that the Belarusians with their paltry military is going to be able to effectively, without sustaining large casualties and likely giving the Poles a reason to enter into the conflict, I don't think they're going to be able to do anything significant, which is why Ukraine might not even honor this bluff by relocating some of their troops to that part of the border. But I guess we'll have to see, because, they removed these troops at one point for whatever reason. There's all kinds of covert maneuver warfare happening here. They moved them, and then this, of course, freed up those Ukrainian forces who were within that region to go move into the Kursk region. And so that's what happened. So now they're moving them back at the behest of Vladimir Putin. Lukashenko says that he's been contacted by people within the West who've asked him to turn against Vladimir Putin. There's some people who think that Vladimir Putin is actively trying to bait the West into a conventional conflict as we speak, as he's been withholding the brunt of his forces. I mean, there's only 30,000 troops in Kursk of the Russian military, which is well approaching the 1.5 million range. So they clearly don't think that it's that big of a deal at this point in time. You even have Sky News reporters now speculating that, well, maybe it is in fact a 4D play where Vladimir Putin is trying to feign weakness so that Ukraine feels enticed to move more of its forces into that region. And then the Russians are, of course, going to do a very large-scale cauldron-like ambush once they have them all in there and just blow them up with artillery. But, you know, who's to say what's going to happen at this point in time? Remember earlier in the year when I said that the West was likely going to be sending troops into Ukraine. Lo and behold, 2 months later, it came out, Emmanuel Macron, with the troops controversy about sending troops into Ukraine. Of course, they walked it back because of public disapproval for the idea, still committing troops in mercenary form in greater numbers. The idea at the time was that the Western forces would fortify the Ukrainian rear, and that would enable Ukraine's forces to go on the offensive. And I think that's exactly what you're going to see. You're going to see the maintenance of this stasis on the front line by hook or by crook. If that means that the United States is going to slowly time release more powerful weaponry to the Ukrainians as Ukraine starts to cede territory, they will do that very thing in order to try to attrit the Russians without things going nuclear. But now that Russia is changing its nuclear doctrine to allow for the use of nuclear weapons at a lower trigger threshold, that changes the equation altogether. So it's already known that Ukraine is going to be planning on forming dozens of new brigades to be unveiled in 2025. And the question is, where are they going to get the troops to fill the ranks of these new brigades, right? So you're talking about a brigade that's 5,000 troops. Where are you going to get the troops to form dozens of brigades, and what are you going to use these brigades for? Many of the troops could perhaps be Ukrainian troops that are preoccupied in other parts of the country, more westerly, and those troops might move forward while Western troops come in and fill in the back section. And that's when you're going to start to see real serious talks about the imposition of a no-fly zone in the western part of Ukraine, which Poland is already talking about. Now, there's a lot of controversy over what happened over the weekend. If you don't recall, what happened was a drone from one of the hundreds of, I guess, one of the 100 of the Russian drones somehow made its way into Polish airspace, okay? Now, some people are saying, it was probably just an errant drone that went off its territory. Others are saying that this is an attempt by Russia to provoke Poland into entering the conflict. Others are suggesting that maybe there was even a target that it was trying to target, which I think is the most unlikely of scenarios. Of course, recall that back in 2022, or was it early 2023, there was an S-300 missile fired by Ukraine. Ukraine immediately blamed it on Russia, okay, and then it later came out, indeed, that it was Ukraine, so we averted the invocation of Article 4, which would have triggered Article 5, most likely, and probably brought us to the brink of nuclear Armageddon. Fortunately, none of that happened. Since that time, all surrounding nation states have been very reluctant to immediately act on these drone incursions into their territory. Typically, they don't hit anything of significance, they fall in a field. This time it was controversial because it made its way 30 kilometers into Polish airspace. Many people suspect that Poland should have indeed shot this thing down. However, they cite international law, which suggests that you cannot shoot something down unless you are absolutely certain that it is a missile. They claim that they couldn't guarantee that it was, and these drones, these Shahed drones, I presume that they look like planes. You know, when they're flying, they fly at relative similar speeds. to planes. They probably have similar signatures as airplanes, so it's hard to discern them from a missile per se. So in light of that, maybe that's why that decision was made. Not so much that Poland doesn't want to go to war. Poland does want to go to war with Russia, it would appear, but what they don't have is the full support of the United States and Europe as of yet, but they may well get that soon enough, especially if Ukraine folds. They are going to be next on the chopping block, something to contemplate if you are a prepper in Poland and you see the writing on the wall. I really don't know how much time you have left to prepare. What else do we got going on here? Okay, so right now there are exercises currently in the Black Sea. Apparently these exercises are being led by the UK. Okay, let me see if I have my notes for this particular story here. I don't know if I have the details of this particular story. Anyways, there are major exercises currently taking place in the United Kingdom which seem to simulate an attack on Crimea. Now we know that the Ukrainians are guided in many ways by the MI6 and by the UK. We know that they comprise his security detail. Zelensky's security detail is British intelligence. And we know that they've played a heavy hand in instigating and escalating the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Everybody remembers the famous, or infamous, I should say, Boris Johnson visit, in which shortly thereafter, up until that point, there was a strong likelihood that there was a deal that was already signed and getting ready to move into its final stages, which of course fell through as a result of that visit, where Boris Johnson compelled Ukraine to continue to fight the Russians and that they would receive support from the West. Now, this chameleon exercise of the UK armed forces, according to Rybar, which of course is a Russian perspective, but they are surprisingly objective. And the reason why I respect Rybar, when you had all the Russia bros saying, the invasion of Kursk is no big deal, Rybar was like, yeah, it's kind of a big deal. Okay, this is what's happening. And, Rybar was making a big deal, as they should. I mean, it was Russia being invaded by a NATO-backed force. So anyways, the Armed Forces of Ukraine commands forthcoming operation in the Black Sea region. We're not talking about combined drone strikes, but the use of landing groups in Crimea and the Kherson region. And they're saying that this seems to emulate what is happening with this chameleon exercise in the UK, which we know has very close ties to Nord Stream, and not Nord Stream, Nord Stream also, but of course the AFU, the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The list of tasks to be accomplished in this chameleon exercise is noteworthy. Covert deployment of special forces teams to the target area, landing from boats and helicopters, infiltration into the rear, targeting of critical facilities, and subsequent evacuation of sabotage groups. It starts to look like perhaps this is a dry run for what they're about to do in the Black Sea. Now recall, they're trying to attrit the infrastructure and the logistics of Crimea at this point in time. They just took out the biggest rail ferry, the last one, in fact, that Russia had to bring in supplies. So now if the Crimean bridge is destroyed, which it could very well be now that all of this attention is on Kursk, you might see maybe the whole point of this Kursk thing is to distract away from that, and then they're just going to start hammering the Crimean bridge as hard as they possibly can. And then, of course, they can have that Pyrrhic victory to take to Joe Biden before election season and say, hey, we're actually doing something. So that's what's going on there today. I mean, there's a hell of a lot more going on. You have the Wagner forces, like I said, moving into the Kursk region as well as into the southern part of Belarus. You have Poland panic buying gold. The National Bank of Poland became the world's biggest buyer of gold among central banks, together with India, in the second quarter of 2024, which is why it continues to break records on a daily basis. And again, Duda The president of Poland and Zelensky indicated that we have talked about this many times, and it requires, as I understand it, if we want Poland to shoot down missiles over our territory, the support of several countries. Poland, as I understand it, is hesitant whether or not we'll be left alone with the decision. Sergei Lavrov's comments on nuclear weapons are very important, and I just want to reiterate this before we move on. The doctrine of Russia's use of nuclear weapons is now being clarified, he says. Clarified. So it's not so much anymore just about what do they mean by strategic and existential threats. I think what this means is they're going to shed light on the actual kilotonnage and what the exact thresholds are. Now, in reference to the U.S. distancing themselves from the Kursk initiative, recall that the United States said, we have nothing to do with this. Here's what Lavrov had to say. This is an attempt to pretend that the West wants to avoid excessive escalation, but in reality, it is deceitful. The West does not want to avoid escalation. The West, in Russian, is asking for it, he claims, and he goes on to use far more colorful language here when he says, and we once again confirm that playing with fire and they, like little children, are playing with matches. It is a very dangerous thing for adults and nannies who are entrusted with nuclear weapons in one or another Western country. Again, not the type of aggressive rhetoric that we're accustomed to hearing the foreign minister of Russia use. So I think that things are really approaching a critical moment in all of this. Now, I want to address a video that I released a few weeks ago that continues to get trolling comments on a daily basis. Recall, after the assassination in Iran of the Hamas leader by the Israelis, the Pentagon came out with a statement, and they indicated that they thought that Iran was going to attack, do a retaliatory strike within 72 hours, that there was an exceptionally high likelihood of that being the case. Of course, that never transpired or hasn't transpired yet. As far as we know, it's going to happen very soon because, once again, John Kirby has said that Iran will attack. Now, say what you will about how deceitful Pentagon messaging is, and it is, for some reasons, for national security reasons, as it has to be. Usually when they say something like that, there's definitely something there. Recall that they predicted the Russian invasion. Whether or not you believe Ukraine was the ones who were going to attack first or whatever, we're going to get into the reasons why the Pentagon makes these statements, but they do predict things. The Crocus terrorist attack. They predicted that about 3 or 4 weeks before it happened. They said that we advise people get out of Moscow because we predict there's going to be terror attacks. I think they even recently said something about that in Europe. And then, of course, you had those incidents that have unfolded in Europe in recent days, the terrorist attacks there. So when the Pentagon says something, there's a reason for it. What is that reason? Could be worlds apart. It could be that indeed they have intelligence that the other side is getting ready to do something, and they're trying to deter the other side from doing it, putting them on notice that, hey, we know and we are ready for you, so don't try anything. Okay, that is the most innocuous position. A more sinister position, nefarious position, would be that they themselves are getting ready to do an attack, and they are going to do it under the pretext. They're going to frame it as a preemptive strike to preempt the attack. So like proactive defense. So like what the Israelis did, well, we got intelligence that Hezbollah was going to attack, so we had to hit them really hard, right? So setting it up so that they can justify a preemptive strike. That's one possible reason. Not what I think is the most sinister Machiavellian of reasons why you would want to do it. The other thing could just be, like I said, to either dissuade, or perhaps they are just sincerely expecting an attack and they don't know what exactly they are going to do with it. It could be one of those things. But I just wanted to put that out there because when I give you this information, this is all coming from reputable sources, whether it is reputable analysts, military analysts, politicians, and just because something doesn't happen right away, and of course you have all these pea-brains out there who think that, you know, these things are supposed to happen within a given predictable timeline. Well, it's never like that. There's a big game of chess going on, and when one side is sending out a public statement like that, it's part of the whole play. It's the signal to the other side, either to deter them or potentially even incriminate them so that we can play the victim. When it does happen, we can say, well, we warned you that they were going to attack us in an unprovoked manner, and sure enough they did. Or it's to cover our own covert operations and our own pre-crime preemptive strike type stuff. So there's a reason for it. So again, I stand by my hypothesis that day X is inevitable at this point. It's you know, we're heading towards it at 1,000 miles per hour, and there doesn't seem to be anything that is slowing it down. There's been nothing de-escalatory that has happened in years, really. Since October 7th, there's been nothing that's happened that's de-escalatory. There's been periodic exchanges of prisoners, but the ceasefire deal is now not even being talked about anymore. The Israelis, as we speak, are currently doing a massive incursion into the West Bank with thousands of soldiers. So all around, everybody is getting more and more involved and embroiled in this very, very quagmire of a military situation unfolding in the Middle East. In particular, this is a video that was released by one of the Iraqi, I believe, what was the name of this group? Kataib Sarka al-Quds, formerly known as the Iran-backed Iraqi Ashab al-Kahf militia, published footage threatening to target Sarek Nuclear Research Center in Israel. Now, if you recall, Israel recently claimed that, yeah, Hezbollah never hit our military bases. And of course, it now is known, according to CNN, I believe, that, was it CNN or Bloomberg? It was one of those, I can't even remember, but it was a, you know, a reputable fake news agency here in the West. They basically stated that, yes, Israel has put a gag order on people in terms of releasing various video footage of military bases. Well, we have footage of that night of an Israeli military base, geo-confirmed, being hit multiple times, nearly a dozen times, by very small Hezbollah rockets, and the Israelis claim this never happened. So you really have to start asking the question, what else is happening that they claim has never happened? Why is Netanyahu hiding in a bunker? It must be pretty serious if they're hiding in a bunker. Now, maybe they're just trying to play it up once again so that they can justify more preemptive, proactive defense. But we know that they tend to lie and fudge the numbers quite a bit. So we can expect that they'll continue to do so in the future, and that maybe Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis have been far more effective in their strikes than we've been led to believe. I mean, there's a lot of warships that have went home with their tails between their legs. Is it because they've actually been hit by the Houthis, who target these warships quite frequently? It's possible, but I guess we will never know. We will never know, unfortunately. According to President Biden, he says that he orders all U.S. forces within the region to defend Israel at all costs. This, of course, is after John Kirby said that Iran is going to attack their position and ready to launch an attack on Israel at any moment. Biden has issued a global directive for all U.S. forces to defend Israel in the event of war. He's authorized the destruction of Iranian nuclear facilities and weapons storage sites. Now, that last part is a subject of debate. Of course, that is something which is encoded in the resolutions that have been signed within the last year that indicate that indeed, if Iran is pursuant of nuclear weapons, then the U.S. has justification to come to the aid of Israel. So it's already, in the law, but I think it would still need approval from Joe Biden himself. And if he's saying that that's what they're going to do, then we must take them on their word that that's indeed what they're going to do. What else do we got going on here today? I think that's about it. I got to get going here. I got work to do. I got work to do on the homestead, man. It is a lot of work. A ton of work. But it's going to be worth it when it's all built. Take a look at this. Chinese SKS. $809. I guess it has some kind of honor guard. Whatever that means. 800, and that's a sale. This is in Canada. 899. Now I've seen them as low as 600, but when I bought my first SKS, which wasn't that long ago, it was only 250 bucks, and that was a Russian one. So I don't know if the Chinese are more expensive than the Russian or what, but that is expensive. Nearly $1,000 when you think of taxes and all that for a Chinese SKS. That's unbelievable. That's inflation. And, you know, besides gold, one of the best hedges against inflation is firearms. Although I will say that the Mossberg Maverick 88 is still under 300 bucks, I think. And when I bought mine, it was around the same price. So that one is actually not held up against inflation too well, but most of those firearms, especially the semi-autos, will. I just wanted to show you this. This is the Chinese with 10,000 vehicles building a 17-kilometer canal in 10 days, okay? 10 days. The coordination and the discipline exhibited by the Chinese industrial sector is just on another level. You know, I mean, this would take Canada 10 years to do, and there'd be all kinds of bureaucratic red tape and all this bullshit which would prevent it from being done, and a bunch of people trying to F the dog so they can draw the work out. But with a authoritarian regime, pseudo-capitalistic, communistic regime like China, you can do this kind of shit. Now, the reason why I show you this is just think about what they're going to be able to do when they turn on the weapons manufacturing. It doesn't matter if the tanks are cheap, if you can build 100 in the time that it takes us to build one. You know what I'm saying? I mean, so just extrapolate what you're seeing here to other industrial endeavors of a military sort. And then you start to see why it is complete and utter madness that we're getting ready to go to war on Taiwan's behalf. Right now, Jake Sullivan is going to China for 3 days, and he's going to try to pressure Beijing into reducing its cooperation with the Russians. But I'm pretty sure that the Chinese, they'll probably play along in the sense that they will try to, because again, you know, all of the Axis, they all have a vested interest in, they all know that their number is going to be called someday. So the Chinese have a vested interest in Russia continuing to fight this war. The Chinese have a vested interest in Iran fighting a war, although not one that is going to necessarily compromise their ability to get oil. So if anything, the Chinese want the US to not escalate in the Middle East. But I don't think they actually care so much about Russia. And this could be an underhanded thing where maybe they tell Jake Sullivan, hey, we'll stand down. Sure we will. I mean, what are they going to do? Are they going to, nobody has access to China's books. Nobody knows what China is doing on the back end in order to support the Russians. They could be supporting them in a variety of different ways. Obviously economic. China is not going to reduce its imports of Russian goods and raw materials for the United States, especially when the U.S. is surrounding their borders. What I'm saying is they might play along a little bit just to try to embolden the United States to do something stupid like getting in or pushing the Russians even more beyond the thresholds of their nuclear doctrine. In fact, I would say that the Chinese perhaps are in a position, if you really look at it, the Chinese probably want Russia to occupy NATO because they know that they can still get oil from Russia and that Russia is dependent on them. but they don't necessarily want a war in the Middle East, because of course that means that they can't get that oil from Saudi Arabia and Iran if the Gulf of or if the Strait of Hormuz gets closed. So you really have to look at this from in those real terms, you know, just looking at war in real terms. The Chinese stand to benefit if the Russians, who may be their adversary in 50, 100 years, who knows, when the dust settles and the US empire is dethroned, then there'll be another challenge, right? So ultimately, they stand to gain more by keeping the US preoccupied in Europe than they do in the Middle East, as that affects their oil supply. And the Russians, of course, stand to gain by having the Middle East. And this is why you don't see a great Chinese presence in the Middle East, because they're not trying to instigate or be a part of anything that might encourage one side to do something. Whereas the Russians are in there right away, giving the Iranians the weapon systems that make them feel emboldened to perhaps retaliate, which of course we know is going to be met with a response. So it's a love triangle, if you can call it that. And the Iranians, unfortunately, I don't know if they necessarily stand to benefit. I guess they do stand to benefit from the Russians fighting a war on their front and the Chinese fighting, because they're all fighting essentially the same Pax American agenda. What else do we got going on here? I talked about the massive oil refinery that's now went up in smoke again in Russia. That's crazy. You know, that those things are happening every single day, and the price of oil is just wah, wah. Coffee hit an all-time high today. The price of coffee, it was, I think this is, I don't know if this is tons. $1,000, would that be a ton? It was about close to $1,300 back at the low point of 2020. Now, coffee is around $5,500. Isn't that something? So stock up on coffee. Unfortunately, you have to get freeze-dried coffee. You got to get instant coffee if you're a prepper. But I tell you, that is one hell of a barter item post SHTF. And oh yeah, just so you guys know, we finally got in the new shirts today, the other new shirts. These are certified Canadian preparedness shirts. They got the label on the back. This is not your cheap run-of-the-mill t-shirt, Redbubble crap. These are very form-fitting, very nice materials. It took me a long time to find a local Canadian manufacturer who made these things, and they're really awesome. And we have a bunch of different varieties for men, women, different sizes, different colors, and there's going to be more iconography that we use in the future. And we got a Normalcy Norman t-shirt coming up. Quite frankly, you shouldn't buy t-shirts, but people want t-shirts. You should be buying preps. I would much sooner you go to CanadianPreparedness.com and stock up on preparedness items that you're going to need first before you go down that road to preparedness vanity. But hey, whatever floats your boat, if you want to support the channel in a cool sort of way, it's a great conversation starter. It's not too in your face. Survival mode. You're not saying much, right? That doesn't mean you got to talk their ear off about the World Economic Forum or how much you hate Justin Trudeau or whatever tickles your fancy. It just means that, you know, you have a conversation about, yeah, what is survival mode, you know? And maybe you start to make friends. Maybe the guy that, you know, you meet at the water cooler every other day, he strikes up a conversation, he says, oh yeah, I just got myself, you know, such and such a survival tool, and, you know, before you know it, you're best friends. Anyways, guys, I got to get going here. Got a lot of work to do on the homestead. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Out.